Hello, good evening. It's good to be here this evening. My name's Todd, as Michelle's introduced me as. I'm going to be talking to you about AngularJS. Let me pop that into presentation mode. So, AngularJS is really hitting off in the web development industry, I think, over the last sort of couple of months. I think it's really come into effect. Is anybody here using AngularJS at the minute, or show of hands? Yeah, good amount of people. Okay. So right, let's kick things off. I'll do a quick introduction for those who are interested. Who am I? I'm lead front-end developer at a company called AppsBroker. We're a Google company, so we do lots of googly things, Google Apps deployments, and write software for Google customers, which means that we can use the latest APIs and technology. Angular being a Google product, we're hands-on with it. I've created a product called Conditionalizer, HTML5 blank and Fire Shell, for if anybody's heard of those. And this year I partnered with Intel and Rolling Stone to bring a HTML5 piece to life on the web, if anybody saw that. So the session overview, what I want to look at is what I would call the modern web, and then the key concepts of any application development. So MVC, I'll touch on MVC for those who haven't heard about MVC, as well as data binding, which Angular relies heavily on, and the AngularJS core features. So hopefully this will enlighten some people, if they're not using Angular, to consider it. I found it an incredible tool since I started in AppsBroker, which was just under a year ago now, and we've been using it ever since. So first off, what is AngularJS? It's a client-side MVC framework. Now, typically MVC is usually on the server, so MVC is model, view, and controller. It's a design methodology for the back end, but the Google guys have said, why don't we bring this onto the client side? So they've built a really nice JavaScript framework which does exactly that. And you can see my second point, the server and the client, and the AIO stands for all-in-one, which means that they brought what you can do on the server to the client, which is very, very powerful. And it means that as a developer unit, we're just using one language. We're not sort of doing a little bit with JavaScript on the front end, relying on the server for other things. Other great things that Angular does is rapid application development, as well as prototyping. So you can develop and prototype applications very, very quickly, and we turn around an application in a month or a couple of months, depending on the size, obviously. Focus on data-driven applications. So it says no DOM manipulation. So how many here are jQuery users who have used jQuery before? So yeah, everybody. Okay, so what you're used to doing in development, you get into work, you sit down, you do your nice $ and brackets and dot my class. So Angular, don't do that at all. So what it does is allows you to focus on the data, data only. So where you've got data present or you're changing data, you don't have to think about the DOM, you just focus on the core. So Angular will actually add the classes, remove the classes, do all that stuff for you, so you can concentrate on actually delivering a project. So I said I'd talk about what I would consider the modern web. These things might not be here yet, but things like web components and shadow DOM, they're coming into effect. But client-side templating, it's probably been around for quite a while. jQuery had a stab at it, but Angular does this very, very intelligently and very well. So what I'm going to do is look at the modern web and look how Angular cross-references over, allows us to do all these things now. Things like web components and shadow DOM. These are very, very new technologies which allow us to think completely differently and think more Angular with just basic HTML. HTML5 data attributes. I'm a massive fan of data attributes. They bind data. You can call data, you can use them as selectors. Angular makes use of the data binding facilities very, very nicely, and allows you to create very, very rich interfaces. SPAs, single page applications. When I first started at AppsBroker, we had a .jsp and we had a .jsp this and an emails.jsp, and we ended up with 15, 20 different JSPs for one application. It gets very, very messy. So the single page application which Angular allows you to do is just to have one page, and you've got your views in the middle, and they'll just inject intelligently. So you just got one page, very, very little code base, very easy to manage, and more JavaScript, which I'm happy about. I know a lot of people aren't, because obviously they say, what about no JavaScript users and stuff like that, but I think now that with things like Node.js, it's very important for people, even jQuery writers, to be able to write JavaScript, because I think JavaScript's going to be here very, very long in the future to stay at a much higher level. So for those who are unsure what MVC is, I'll just very, very briefly touch on that and the data binding, just so you know what I'm talking about in a minute. So model is typically our application data, which is usually sent down via JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. It comes in a form of wiggly data, basically, which is interpreted by your code, and then you'll render it on the client. View, which I consider as our rendered HTML, all the components that we're going to be creating, and our templates. What is then outputted is called the view. And a controller. So the controller is the communications between the server and the client. If you think of it as a kind of a middleman stood in the middle, grabbing data from the server, pushing it to the client and back. It also, with Angular, it's very, very powerful because it drives the model and the view changes automatically. So you're writing very little code and you're getting a lot using the Angular framework. Two-way data binding. This is a very, very powerful feature of AngularJS. What it basically means is when you get model data back from the server, it'll get pushed to the view, and if the user makes a change, it updates the model instantly, and if the server makes a change, it updates the view instantly. So you've got this continuous cycle of updated data, which I'll touch on with some good examples. Thinking with Angular, I like to call this the 3Ds. I came up with this saying on my last talk about Angular, which is design, declare, and distribute. So I'll just talk about these three. So design, we're taking our JSON here. So I've created some very simple dummy data. So we've got an email from Steve Jobs and an email from Bill Gates. And typically we'll probably load our application and grab this data down from the server. So declaring that data, so anybody who's had experience with objects, you'll know that you can see I've got email.from and email.subject. So these are just object properties. So Angular uses a very clever ng repeat here. So for every object in that array, it will just keep stamping the repeat. So you get a dynamic list of emails generated on the client very, very quickly as well. And finally, distribute, which you should do in the controller. So here I'm grabbing my endpoint, which will be emails, and then on success of that function, I'll push it into the scope, which I'll touch on what is the scope. So the core features, of which I like to call the wow parts of Angular. So hopefully you're going to go home tonight and think, yeah, Angular's pretty cool. I'm going to look at it later. So handlebar bindings. Hopefully everybody's seen something like this before, whether it be something like Jekyll or on the server with maybe another language. Essentially what Angular will do, you'll set up scope.username equals Todd for demonstration purposes, and then instead of rendering it on the server, what we'll do is we'll put the handlebars in, we'll look for that scope called username, and we'll pull it in. And then when the page is rendered, we'll get welcome, comma, Todd. So the simplicity of controllers, I like to think that Angular is pretty simple. I had a look at a couple of other frameworks, Backbone, Ember as well, and Knockout.js, sorry. And I find that Angular is very, very simple when it comes to controllers. So here we're declaring a variable called myApp. Angular uses a module-based approach for separating parts of the application. So what I can do here is just declare a myApp and then bolt in a controller. My controller here is called users control, which you'll see I pass in the scope here and the scope here. What this is called is dependency injection, and it sounds pretty funky and forward thinking, but it's actually very, very simple. You're just telling your code that I want this, and it will inject it on runtime. So what we're doing here, as I said earlier, typically when the page loads, we'll make a get to users, and then on success of that function, we get the data sent back, and then we just want to show the username, so scope.username, which we'll create, and then we'll grab the username property from that data sent back, which we can assume is an object. Two-way data binding. As I said earlier, it keeps the model and the view in sync, so there's no re-querying and very, very quick updates. A very good example of this, so right, I've got my ng model here, and my username. So following on from the previous example, where we're pushing the username here, scope.username, this then becomes available here. So what we can do, where we've got these handlebars, they're not just for templating, therefore they're buying data constantly and they're always looking for changes. Angular call them dirty checking, which is a process of waiting for things to be updated so that they can update the bindings. So here, if we're, sorry, it's slightly annoying flicking between the two, but it helps explain things. So we can assume that this data.username is Todd. So let's assume that this is Todd. As we've got a model previously set up, Angular will know that. So you're not just going to get an empty text box here. You're going to get an input with the name Todd on it. So what we can do here is to say, so if username is Todd, we can leave out the other logic to make it appear when you type in and all that stuff. So pretend that's there for the minute. So when we start typing, it says save username as Todd xxxx, and then upon this, you've got a question mark here. So update username, which is a scope function in Angular, which we'll come on to, the ng-click directives and stuff. So this is a scope function. You'll notice it says callbackless data manipulation. So again, I'm touching on the no jQuery thing, no dollar this, dollar that, apart from dollar scope, obviously. So instead of when a user presses delete on, so let's say an email, instead of requerying the DOM, finding how many is in the list and then deleting the last one or finding which one they selected, we let Angular do all this for us based on the data that you've provided. So here we can bind a function. You see ng-click, which is a very, very neat method of binding and making use of the on-click handlers that we used to do, on-click equals function. But the benefit with these is that these aren't global functions, so they're a lot safer than what was being done in JavaScript previously. So Angular is very, very clever. It provides you a lot of things for free. You just pass in the index automatically and you'll get a 0, a 1, a 2, wherever it is in the array. Then you've got the email, which will be an object, the one that we're iterating over as well. So when I call delete email, we've got a fancy delete button. We'll press delete. This then makes a call to HTTP delete, and we'll grab that one. On success, we'll then grab the scope, .emails, and then we'll splice that current index. So, and that Angular will just go, so there's a change been made, where is it in the array, let's take it out, and then the user sees that automatically. Previously, you would delete an email, you might have a spinner or something and have a callback, but Angular will do it automatically based on the data, and you're not even touching DOM elements here. Templating. Templating is very, very powerful. Scalability and reusability here. What you would do for things like, let's just assume an application like Gmail. We've got our inbox title at the top. We've got a list element here. ng repeat email equals email in mymodel.emails. So let's assume mymodel.emails is an array of objects. Each object is an email with some corresponding data. We're going to iterate through these. We're going to bind a click function which says view email. The from and the subject here are all going to be populated for us. You'll also notice that Angular is a bit more intelligent. So inbox here, when you log on to Gmail or whatever account you use in the panel or in the title, you might get brackets 2 or something like that. So you can actually call the length here. So it'll obviously be 0 if there are none. No, it won't show up. Sorry, 0 is in the array. So this makes templating very, very quick and very, very powerful. What we would previously do on the server is set up this kind of logic that says, let's loop through this object, but then when it's rendered on the client, that's not very easy to update. So what we do is put all the logic on the client, which makes things very, very quick, very, very instantaneous. So a directive, once we've created a template, what do we do with it? So you can see here that for those who are into sort of HTML5, you'll have come across web components. Web components is a new spec that allows you to create your own elements. So here I'm going to create an element called emails list, which if you've got 5 different pages, let's say, that actually have this list of emails, you don't want to keep copying and pasting the same code, you just want to declare it once. So a directive allows you to do this. You'll see here it says template URL, emails.html. So you declare the directive and it'll inject the code in that template for you. And you can set the scope and tell it what data to populate it with. So it's very, very quick. It makes changes very, very seamless because you're just managing the code from one place and it'll update it everywhere. I'll run through some of the directive stuff because this is one of the most powerful features in Angular. You've got restrict, which if you're working in a team that, let's say, we develop for primarily Chrome users, we might restrict it to E, which up here, if you can see, E is an element. So in IE 7 and 8, this is quite buggy, so we don't have to cater for those, so we can just restrict it to E if we wanted to. It is probably a safe bet to leave it as EA because it gives you the opportunity to easily switch back. But it's good to check the Angular documentation for this kind of thing. You can see here I've used it as an attribute, which is A. So I've got div emails list, which I can just declare as an attribute. Replace true. So when it's injected the code, you might not want that outer div to exist. It can cause styling issues or manipulative issues. So you can do replace true, and it will take that element and replace it with your template code. Transclude is very clever. Transclude, for things like tabs, you don't want to be creating titles and nested divs and then more nested divs, and this is the tab that's controlling this panel and stuff like this. So you can create very, very simple directives that can hold perhaps just an attribute called, so you may have emails list and then title equals name, and that could be pulled through using transclude into the template that's populated. So it allows you to carry data across that's predefined into the new template. Link. So I've been talking no DOM manipulation so far, but using directive, they encourage you to use any DOM manipulation that you need. Usually you can just use scope, so you usually don't need to do $this, $that. But Angular gives you the element that your directive is if you need to bind behavior to it. Expressions. I think these are my favourite part of Angular. Very, very simple. Our Java guys, when I first opened a JSP, you see this kind of logic in line, and you think, oh, that's quite clever, but what about if we can do that on the client? So this allows you to do it on the client. So we're evaluating the data here, so we're going to assume that myModel.emails is an array, which an array has a length. And when the array length is greater than 0, we can assume that there's probably going to be an email. So we're going to call it emails. If not, we're just going to let the expression say no emails. And this comes in really helpful when, well, everywhere in your code we use them probably in all of our templates, and it saves you sort of one querying the DOM. Otherwise, you'd have to sort of give this p tag a class, maybe call it emails or is there emails, and then go, if there is emails, change the inner HTML to this, else change it to this. But Angular gives you all that for free and very, very inline, very quick. The other benefit is that if you have all your emails and you were to delete an email and delete the final email, Angular would still be checking this length, so it reverts itself to no emails. So it's very, very instantaneous as well. Filters very, very clever. You can apply them to very, very many things. They can be bound to input fields. You can replace white space with them with hyphens, which we've done on a couple of apps. They're declared in the same way as everything else. So with my app.filter, I'm going to assume that we're going to create one called important. So we want to loop through our emails again, but just filter them with the important ones. So in Gmail you get the little star down the side. That'll grab all of those. And again, we just echo in the properties. Dynamic views and routing. We started using this very, very powerfully a couple of months ago, and really, at first glance, it looks very static, but what it actually does is quite amazing. So, what we're essentially telling Angular, when we're at /emails, we're going to use the template emails. Sits in a view folder, it's very easy to manage. And we'll assume that our ng repeat is in there that's just repeating over our emails. But what happens when we click on an email? So we might have a function called view the email, which each email will have a corresponding ID, let's assume, and an ID might be #3456. So the ID will correspond in here, and we'll just make up a template called email single, which will turn that data into a readable view, like a conversation flow view, automatically. So you're not actually creating URLs. Angular interprets a given URL and fills the data up with it. So factories are what I think are abstracted logic to keep things very dry. You might have 4 different controllers, you might have 40 different controllers in an application. What you don't want to be doing is doing HTTP GET, HTTP POST. So what you'll do instead is abstract the data. So if you've got an email-driven application, you might do get emails and create a function that does that. So you're hiding all this logic, and what you can do then is dependency inject I've called it JSON factory. I'm going to call it get users. I'm just going to have a callback with it, and that means that if the URL changes, if I want to handle any more callbacks in here, if I want to return anything else, then I can do, and I can just change it in one place, and it makes the development cycle a lot faster. So when it comes to validation, there's a lot of bad code on the web. There might be a script for disabled and required attributes. Angular packs all this stuff in for you, and it will actually react. You see I've written here the model says no. If the model says no, then you're not getting through. So we're going to assume that the user wants to update their username here. If there's no username.length, then the button's going to remain disabled. If there is a length, then the button becomes enabled and they can post the form. It's a very, very simple demonstration, but one thing we did in the previous application was have 3 select menus, and you choose one, and it gives the next model the data it needs to then become enabled, and then when you select the next one, it gives the one underneath the model to become enabled. And to write that in JavaScript would probably take at least 20 lines, and in Angular you just add an attribute and it does it for you. So thinking Angular, I think I've touched on forget that the DOM exists and stop using dollar this, dollar that. A couple of people have been tweeting me over the last couple of weeks saying, how do I do this in Angular? Can you check out my Angular code? And there'll be sort of var my input equals and then a string of input code, and they're injecting that and grabbing the value using like .val in the jQuery method. So you don't need to do any of that. Everything's driven by the scope, and the scope holds all the data, it updates all the data, and you just pass it between the server and the client. It's very, very simple and very, very fast. So think about components and layers. So when we first started application development, everything was hard-coded on pages, and you get pages and pages of this stuff. But when you start to repeat code, take a bit of code out, abstract it into a template, into a new file, and then using directives you can inject that very, very easily, which I've just mentioned as the point 3. So are there any questions from anybody on the topics? Nope. Okay. If you okay.
Question, actually. So I understand that Angular supports IE 8 and above.
Yeah.
What would you use if you needed IE 7 support as well?
Angular uses a lot of query selector dependencies in the source code. I'm not sure, I've never actually used IE7 with Angular, so we develop for Chrome only, so we only go back so far. But I don't think it does work with IE7. If it does, it's very buggy. What they do is include something called jQuery Lite. So the Angular team have said, oh, we really like this stuff in jQuery, but jQuery is massive, so we're going to create our own mini subset of jQuery. If you include the full jQuery library as well, which you might as well do if you're going to be using plugins and stuff, because every application needs a plugin, it makes it a lot easier, and Angular will actually recognise that jQuery exists. Just ignore its own jQuery Lite, and I don't know whether that functionality then provides that fallback. So that would be, I'll look into that as well. So he was first.
Yeah, have you ever used Angular UI? Because, for example, I was trying to do something very simple, like drag and drop. I had the list, and I want to drag and drop something, and it's a sort of list basically. And for some absurd reason, I couldn't make Angular UI work. It wasn't even as simple as include the Angular UI library and then use something. And then I ended up using a directive with jQuery, which is a bit hacky, but I did it.
Yeah, so Angular UI is a pretty big project by itself. One of the things that is quite difficult to keep up with is the pace of development. It is owned by Google, and they send updates every couple of weeks, and you'll be on version 1.0, and then you'll be at 1.0.2 and 3 and 4. I think we're on 0.7 at the minute or something. But it's then caused this breaking changes from these other projects that then rely on that code. So if you want to use the latest and greatest Angular, but you're set on using UI, we've had so many problems with external frameworks that just don't keep up with the speed of Google. So that may have been something. But one of the, there's a project manager at Google called Brad Green. He heads up the Google project, and I've been speaking to him. A lot of people sort of say, oh, I'm going to go and create this in Angular just because I can. And I said, is this a good idea? Because I'm just rewriting code that works in Angular with no apparent reason. Like we had a scrolling sidebar, and as you scroll down the page, it then highlights the tab that you're on, the relevant part in the code, in the UI. Sorry. And I kind of thought, this has just caused a break and change, like probably what you had seen. And I just reverted back. I said, it's not even bound to any model, it's not bound to a controller, it's just doing it with Angular. So that's one of the things that I probably could have included on the think in Angular bit, is don't try and create everything in Angular. They do encourage it, but if it doesn't need to be in Angular, then don't bother. What we used to do is everything in Angular, and you just end up with this huge framework. The good news is that if you do that, and you're primarily building with Angular, so if you've got a very good working directive like your UI, you can easily lift it and just put it in a new project.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you approach, if you are going to approach a project, do you take the stance that if the user has JavaScript turned off, or JavaScript feels too low, then they just get a blank page, or is there some best practice around creating some sort of basic experience with JavaScript turned off?
Yeah, there is a lot of debate on whether you should use Angular for everything. There's a lot of people who do tests on the initial page load. So with the JavaScript framework, the initial page load, it may take a second, maybe shorter, to actually come up in the view. And then if you refresh it, the cached version, which is the stuff sent down properly, we'll call it, it loads again instantly quick, whereas the JavaScript will probably take the same amount of time, apart from images and stuff like that. What people have started doing is on first refresh, on first load, sorry, get the server to render it all. So the server may interpret that ng repeat and automatically populate for us. So we do get an app of some kind. It just kind of, but we would generally put a notice up saying you need JavaScript for this. The stuff that we generally create is dynamic SVG, so we're interacting with the DOM, which you just can't do without JavaScript, and the clients accept that, which is brilliant. Go on.
Yeah, sorry, related to that question, I don't know if you're aware of Render, which is like it's on GitHub, it's written by Airbnb.
Is that render.io?
I'm not sure, it's on Airbnb's GitHub, and basically their site is built on Backbone, but they have a system whereby they use Node to write those Backbone templates to the server, and it's served by Node if someone with JavaScript disabled hits their server.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I was just wondering if there is some sort of equivalent for Angular.
I haven't actually looked into that, but I have looked into the SEO side of things, because I love this framework to bits, and when I do bits of work on the side and stuff, as every developer would, and what we would do is, what I would want to do is build the actual website in AngularJS, because I can just create it very, very simply, very, very quickly. Whereas in something like PHP, I'm no PHP guy, so I kind of bodge my way on the back end and then create a site like that. And what I think it was pre-render, I think it was called, which might be something different. But pre-render uses Node, and it renders the JavaScript and then takes a snapshot of that, uploads it to the server, and then if the Google bot were to come around, it sends it to that. So that's probably very, very similar, but for the actual end user rather than the Google bot. Anyone else? Okie dokie. I'll hand you back to Michelle.
Actually, I have a question.
Okay.
What do you use for presentation framework?
Oh, I'm not allowed to tell you, I'm afraid. It's called reveal.js.
All right.
You can customize it to pieces, but I just left it as the default because it's very, very easy. I will put the slides online later, so I think Michelle mentioned that you can follow the link on the future site, and they should be on there as well. Okay. Cool, we've got I'll grab you in a minute if you like.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, about really large objects. Let's say you make a call and you get like 2 million objects and you have to filter that. How does it work? Is it like performance-wise?
We kind of sit down with the back-end guys at the beginning and say, is this chunk of data going to persist, or is it going to be, are there going to be refreshes and stuff like this, or two kind of options what I would do, either send down the ginormous load of data or write it into the page, so the Java guys kind of try and sneak their JSPs back in, and I might let them away with index.jsp, and we might have a JSP tag which gives us, if you right click view source on Gmail, there'll be a load of JavaScript, and we kind of do that as well, so we let the server render all the JSON so it's already there, which isn't very costly on performance. And when it comes to if you do a HTTP GET and get a loaded data, either create a separate hash map for that data, because you might not want to use it all, you might just want to use 2 properties of a 50 property object, so create a little store. And what you can do in Angular is something called the root scope. So if you imagine it as a ginormous scope called the root scope, every scope that you create is then a child of the root scope. So what you can do is store that initial response on the root scope, and you can change pages all you want and it'll still be there, so you can just access it very, very quickly. Okay.
Is it alright to write in the root scope? I was wondering, I was just writing stuff there, and I was thinking, maybe I shouldn't. Should you write only sides there, or can you write properties? So, for example, dot equals 5 and put it on the root scope. Is that fine?
So root scope.
Dot equals something.
Okay. What I would do is use it for a caching response. So instead of doing HTTP GET in users controller, and then I'll change the page, and then another controller does the same HTTP GET, it makes absolutely no sense. So what I would do is get that GET, write it to my local scope, write it to the root scope then, and then when you're changing controllers, you can just make a quick check that says, if there's any data on the local scope, the root scope, use that, else I'm going to do a GET, because the user might refresh the page, or they might come to a different page immediately.
Yeah, sorry, that's probably a speed question, but what is the cost for the user on the critical path of like this data binding? How fast is it?
Angular say, I think it's 2,000 bindings per page, and you start to notice something slow. We've ran so many speed tests, and even a static site against an Angular built site, it uses a couple of megabytes to render the page. We've even used, we built an application for an enterprise customer in IE8, and it's very, very fast. We didn't come across any issues. Okay.
From test-driven development approach, AngularJS, what test framework do you recommend? And does it tell you does it work nicely?
Yeah.
Attributes and the data binding.
Yeah, the test, there's TDD and BDD. The Google guys, I think they built their own, which they have released. There's Karma E2E, and Jasmine. They all play very, very nicely, and you can just use it very, very well. They also provide you a lot of what they call mocks, so you can mock a backend with Angular and it all comes built in. It gives you all for free, so it's very easy to test. If you are going to use an approach, like I mentioned, that similar to Gmail, where you right-click view source and you've got a load of JSON, we normally do window.global data is what we call it, and then write all the JSON in. You can pass in the window object. They give you $window, $document, pass in $window, and that makes it very, very testable then. Okay. Anybody else? Okay.